thank you for joining in this very important conversation about sexual identity and how to best understand and care for individuals who experience a perception of their gender identity that is not in accord with their biological sex. As a pediatric endocrinologist and physician scientist, my goal is to share with you some of the key information about the biological understanding of human sexuality and ways in which the medical profession has become involved in this contentious social issue. But before doing so, I have to first disclose that I'm not representing my university in my comments this evening. What I will provide for you is only a brief overview of why and how doctors are using various medical tools at their disposal to alter the appearance of the human body to conform to an individual's desired sexual appearance. This motivation is largely based upon a sincere desire to alleviate suffering and to reduce elevated suicide risk in this population. People who experience this sex discordant gender identity are also known to have high rates of substance abuse, HIV infection, eating disorders, depression, anxiety, and many other psychosocial problems. So without question, these people are seeking help. However, there is a need for a critical assessment of the scientific premises that are used to justify medical interventions, and also an evaluation of the experimental evidence for risk and benefit in this approach to truly provide enduring alleviation of human suffering. In light of what we currently do and do not know, the cause of this condition, about the cause of this condition and overall effectiveness of various treatment approaches in providing long-term resolution of dysphoria and the associated mental health needs, it really is appropriate to question whether what is currently being offered is the most compassionate and effective response. Now, historically, physicians have understood that the root cause of this condition resides within an individual's mind, with primary treatment efforts directed toward addressing underlying psychological difficulties. Over the past decade, largely influenced by ideology rather than by scientific evidence, this understanding has given way to an insistence that the condition be viewed as a part of normal biological variation. Accordingly, the increasingly prevalent medical approach is to encourage and facilitate affirmation of an individual's desired gender identity, even when it conflicts with one's sexual anatomy. The premise here is that the mind is normal and the body is the cause of the dysphoria. Yet it's important to recognize that nearly all of the individuals who are now presenting to the growing number of gender centers around the world have normally formed and functioning sexual organs prior to receiving gender-affirming medical interventions. From a biological perspective, sex is inherently binary and intrinsically linked to reproductive purpose. Despite claims that sex occurs along a continuum, there really are two and only two gonads, testes and ovaries, that contribute to the generation of new human life. The existence of individuals with disorders of sexual development does not change this fundamental fact. Sexual differences between males and females are not limited to the external and internal reproductive organs, but rather exist in every nucleated cell of the body. This is the primary reason why males and females have markedly different disease risks and differing responses to medications, a fact that is well known by our National Institute of Health. So despite many claims by advocates of the affirmation-only approach, science really is unable to establish the claim that people with sex-discordant gender identity are, quote, born in the wrong body. The cause of sex-discordant gender identity remains unknown. The best that science can currently say is that this condition arises from a complex interplay of environmental and biological influences that likely differ in each affected individual. The relative influence of both endogenously produced sex hormones and environmental exposures, it remains unclear, as does the contribution of genetic differences. A notable association between autism and gender dysphoria provides some potential clues, but really no definitive answers. In efforts to link this condition to presumably inborn neurological differences, such as the differential expression of various genes and neuronal pathways in the brain between males and females, fails to recognize the tremendous overlap between males and females, and also that patterned learning can alter brain structure. This is a phenomenon known as neuronal plasticity. Importantly, there is growing evidence that the developmental influences within families and social networks are important, if not predominant, contributing factors for at least some, if not most, of these affected children. A better understanding of the etiology or cause of this condition will greatly aid efforts to develop truly beneficial approaches to caring for these individuals. Now, I'm going to mention briefly the first stage of the affirmative approach, and that is that of social affirmation. And this really isn't a medical intervention, but it's the approach that is most likely to impact most of the listeners in the audience in using preferred names, pronouns, bathroom access, and other features that allow an individual to act in accord with their perceived sexual identity. This is an approach that is now being advocated in very young children and as early as 3 years of age. And we can ask many questions about what this effect is having on these children and also the normal developmental response to that approach. For children who continue to perceive a gender identity that does not align with their sex as they go further on in life, particularly when they enter into puberty, physicians aim to suppress this normal process of bodily maturation that leads to reproductive capacity. And this is done through the use of powerful drugs known as GnRH agonists, or also known as puberty blockers. If this sex discordant gender identity continues, the doctors are then charged with giving cross-sex hormones. And what this means is to give testosterone to an individual that is biologically female but desires to appear male, and estrogen to an individual that is male but desires to appear female. And there are many questions that need to be asked with this intervention in this approach, but many of the questions are difficult to ask in the setting by which many advocacy groups and scientific organizations put forward as this being the only approach that can be used. Yet it's important to recognize that there are numerous limitations to the existing research that is used to support this particular intervention. And this includes the way that the studies are conducted by recruiting patients from a biased population, the lack of proper or even any control group, a short duration of follow-up, observational studies. And by their very nature, these types of scientific experiments cannot establish a causal relationship between an intervention and a response. But despite the poor quality of evidence and the growing evidence that there are many very real risks associated with this approach, which I think I need to say just a few minutes of discussion about. For the cross-sex hormones, we know that the effects can include infertility, stroke, increased heart disease, and many questions about cancer risk. Now, the whole rationale for accepting these risks is the claim that this will prevent suicide in this patient population. However, if one looks long-term in adults, now we have no data on long-term studies from children, but if we look at the effects in adults, after they have been received this affirmation approach by several decades, the best data that we have comes from studies from Sweden, where we have a very large database. And it's known that the suicide risk remains markedly elevated, in fact, about 19-fold above the background population, and all-cause mortality is 2 or 3-fold above the background population. So when we look at this information, we can certainly question whether this is providing a compassionate response. Now, while the affirmation approach continues to be used in the United States without regard to these concerns, several European countries, including the United Kingdom, Finland, and Sweden, have recently shifted to a more cautious approach, acknowledging the low quality scientific evidence and concerns about the ability of gender dysphoric children to adequately consent to potentially sterilizing interventions. And much of this is based on what we know about adolescent children in general, in that they are known to act upon impulse, not be able to perceive long-term consequences. It's the whole basis as to why we restrict many of their ability to purchase alcohol or buy cigarettes and other decisions. Yet in this area, just their desire to change their appearance is deemed sufficient to allow them to be able to go on with these interventions. With all of the questions that I have presented here and many more that we could discuss, it really needs to be questioned whether we're providing truly helpful solutions to this patient population. And there's a dramatic need for alternative approaches for the compassionate care of affected individuals. And thank you so much. I appreciate your attention.
Thank you very much, Paul. And now, friends, we will turn to Dr. Abigail Favali.
Hello, good evening to everyone whose faces I cannot see. I'm going to focus my brief remarks tonight by sketching a more or less linear story of how the concept of gender developed over the last 70 years or so. And then also begin to sketch out some reasons why I think what I call this new gender paradigm is ultimately not a good framework for understanding human beings and interpreting human experience. So I'll begin my story. I'll jump in with Simone de Beauvoir, an existentialist feminist philosopher. So prior to the mid-1950s, gender was a generic term that meant category or kind. You might find references to the feminine gender as a synonym for womankind, but it was more customary to speak of words having gender, like they do in Spanish or Russian. And in 1949, Simone de Beauvoir wrote The Second Sex. And as you can tell from the title, she doesn't actually use the word gender. However, in this book, she does introduce the concept that the term gender would soon come to name. And that is in her well-known line, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." So that statement is the mustard seed of gender theory. So what she's doing here is she's drawing a distinction between the idea of woman and the idea of female, arguing that woman is a social and cultural fabrication that is then layered onto the biological reality of femaleness. So this prefigures the turn toward the concept of gender that would begin in the following decade and then really take hold in the 1970s, largely through the work of psychologist John Money. John Money was the person who coined the phrase gender role, which is so common in our vernacular now. And he was one of the first prominent advocates of the tabula rasa view of the human being, the idea that we are really primarily products of nurture rather than nature. So Money argued that biological sex had no intrinsic connection to men and women's social roles, psychologies, or behaviors. And he imported the term gender from linguistics to refer to those things. John Money's most famous patient was David Reamer, who was brought to him as a baby after his penis was disfigured in a botched circumcision. Money convinced David's parents to raise him as a girl and entrust him to Money's clinical supervision. Now, because David was an identical twin, Money saw this golden opportunity to run essentially a controlled experiment to test out his theory of gender malleability. David was subjected to further surgeries, renamed Brenda, and then both twins met with Money throughout their childhood, at least annually. As a teenager, David Reamer became suicidal. He rejected his feminine identity and eventually learned the truth about his sex. He attempted to reverse the forced reassignment, and as an adult, it seemed that he might have been able to reclaim a normal life for himself. But then he committed suicide in 2004 at the age of 38. And that was just 2 years after his twin brother also committed suicide. So Money's experiment failed catastrophically. His theories about the malleability of gender, and namely its disconnection from sexed embodiment, proved to not only be erroneous, but were actually fatal for both of his research subjects. But unfortunately, this tragedy took decades to play out, right? So It was in the 1960s that the boys first went under Money's care, and then it's 2002, 2004 that the men kill themselves. So in the meantime, Money is publishing his idea, right? He is thinking that his ideas are a success. And so his concept of gender in the 1970s really swept through the academy and became thoroughly entrenched in feminist theory and the social sciences. So in the 1970s, second wave feminists really latched on to Money's idea of gender because they saw this concept as a site of resistance to essentialism, or the idea that men and women are innately different. Following Money, feminists distinguish between sex as a basic biological reality and gender as a socially constructed collection of norms and ideals that are associated with sex and then mistakenly read as natural. So this is the traditional sex-gender split, the classic second wave feminist understanding of sex and gender that I inherited when I began my feminist studies 20 years ago. We can understand why this distinction appealed to feminists because it did facilitate an important move beyond reductive and sometimes misogynistic definitions of what it means to be a woman. Historically, arguments appealing to natural weaknesses or deficiencies in women were used to justify denying them certain rights or access to education. And so this concept of gender allowed feminists to better resist those narratives. However, in the late 1980s, this neat sex-gender distinction began to unravel, thanks to the work of Judith Butler, a philosopher and really the godmother of contemporary gender theory. So Butler ups the ante of social constructionism, asserting that biological sex itself, not just gender, but biological sex is a social fabrication. So this is a quote from her book, Gender Trouble. Female no longer appears to be a stable notion. Its meaning is as troubled and unfixed as woman. Butler leans into many of the ideas asserted by Simone de Beauvoir, but she takes them to new extremes. At one point in The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir makes the statement that nothing is natural. And for Butler, this is a premise of all her philosophy. Nothing is natural. The idea that humankind is characterized by two sexes that are biologically complementary is, for Butler, a social fiction rather than a matter of fact. Now, the key to comprehending Judith Butler is to grasp her reliance on the philosophy of Michel Foucault. I would argue that most inhabitants of the gender paradigm have unwittingly adopted a de facto Foucauldian worldview that's been inherited, at least in part, through trickle-down Judith Butler. So Butler argues, following Foucault, that what we perceive to be real is actually a fiction that is created and enforced by institutional power and language. In this anti-realist perspective, truth is suspended in air quotes as ultimately unknowable or perhaps even non-existent. All that remains is power. Knowledge then is not a matter of discerning or recognizing what is true, because truth itself is a construction of power. Now, this philosophical approach leads to a particular political praxis, namely strategically using language to subvert existing categories and then to reshape the kind of reality you want. But this creates something of a paradox. So on the one hand, I'm arguing that gender theory is fundamentally anti-realist. It rejects the idea that sex or female, man, woman, that those words name anything real. Instead, those concepts are seen as linguistic power moves that create the illusion of something real. And yet, on the other hand, we regularly hear in activist rhetoric or on social media emphatic claims about reality, like trans women are women or sex is a spectrum. Those are statements that make clear assertions about what is real, and they're stated as absolutes. So there's a reification turn that's happening here. Now, to reify means to make real. So the gender paradigm depends upon a radically constructivist, anti-realist view of reality in order to dismantle categories and assert new ones, and then pivots to assert those new categories as actually really true, as unquestionable absolutes. So most people who inhabit the gender paradigm are not hardcore Butlerian anti-realists, at least not consciously, but they have unknowingly entered a paradigm that is at root based in postmodern anti-realism. Ultimately, I would argue that this latest iteration of gender has driven a wedge between body and identity, between female and woman, or male and man. The distinction between sex and gender has become an outright separation. Now, there are multiple problems with this paradigm, and for the sake of time, I can't really go into depth, but I will just sketch out a couple things here. One, it's really dependent upon circular definitions. I mean, the concept within this framework, if you really look at the way words are defined or not defined, they're rife with contradictions and logical fallacies. If you look, for example, at most university websites, they'll have some kind of page that lists definitions of lots of terms related to gender theory, like gender identity, gender expression, transgender, bigender, pangender, right? And if you look at the way those terms are defined, almost all of them are circular. So they appeal to the term gender, but the word gender itself is never defined, right? So gender identity is one's internal self of one's own gender, right? But the concept of gender is never itself defined. Also, the phrase trans women are women. Well, what does the word woman mean in that sentence? So on the one hand, it's appealing to a traditional understanding of woman as an adult human female, but then the very statement rejects that meaning. So again, there's this circularity and this implicit contradiction happening a lot. There's also the problem of the erosion of sex segregated spaces, which ultimately harms women. So the sex segregated spaces that continue to exist in our society, like prisons, bathrooms, locker rooms, and sports, they exist for the benefit of women, not men. And that benefit is tied to distinct physiological differences and vulnerabilities or differing aptitudes between men and women that are based in our biology. So eroding those spaces it ultimately harms women. I also think that if we uproot the idea of man and woman from the body, then the only thing really left to root those in are stereotypes, right? So if a little boy is no longer a little boy simply because he's male, then now he has to somehow perform his gender, right? If he likes to play with My Little Ponies or he likes the color pink, then now we're invited to question whether he's really a boy at all. But that just brings a resurgence of very, I would say, regressive and polarized stereotypes about what it means to be a girl or a boy or a man or a woman. But if we root gender in sex, then that's actually much more freeing because anything I do as a female is an expression of my womanhood, not just things that align with cultural stereotypes. And ultimately, this is a dualistic ideology and anthropology that devalues the body. And Father Tad, I'm sure, is going to go into much more detail about how there's a lot of tensions and contradictions between the gender paradigm and what I would call the Genesis paradigm or the Catholic paradigm. So I'll just list these six levels of, I would say, incommensurability between these two paradigms. So instead of ourselves as creator, in the Catholic understanding, we have a creator and we receive reality as a gift from our creator. It's not something we create ourselves. The body is not an object upon which we kind of project or craft our own ideal self, but rather the body is the sacrament that reveals the inner reality of the person. Sexual difference is not an illusion, but actually part of God's self-revelation to us. And the purpose of language is not to make reality, but actually to name reality. And language is true insofar as it corresponds to what is real. And lastly, freedom is not simply transgressing norms, transgressing boundaries, but freedom is about finding our place in the created order and becoming the kinds of beings and flourishing as the kinds of beings that we were created to be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Favale. To round out our panelist presentations, I'll now turn things over to Father Paholchek.
Very good. Well, it's a great pleasure to be able to be with you this evening. And I've entitled my presentation, Thinking Through Transgender Issues with the Mind of the Church. And so I want to look at some church sources with you and consider the church teaching and to kind of put a context here to our discussion. So I want to start with a broad overview, just a few points that are hopefully somewhat self-evident that, I mean, this is often a very deeply personal issue. Many families are affected as well as many individuals. There's a need for great respect and patience. And yet there is also a very urgent need to be truthful. And I think this is the kind of the crux of what we're attempting to navigate this evening. Also, clearly, there is an unacceptability when we speak about harassment, discrimination, ridicule, or bullying, that these really only perpetuate the kinds of difficulties and make them worse that some individuals are struggling with in situations of gender dysphoria. So I want to mention quickly some Catholic resources that will be of interest potentially. The Vatican has not spoken in great detail, meaning from different congregations. However, there is a document that came out in 2019 from the Congregation for Catholic Education, male and female, he created them. It doesn't deal with all of the issues that would typically come up in the setting of Catholic schools, but it deals with some of them, and it's a good resource, a good launch point into further discussion. Pope Francis offers us very helpful insights at various points in his pontificate. I want to just mention a few of those throughout. One of them was from his general audience in 2015, when he pointed out the differences between man and woman are not for opposition or subordination, but for communion and generation. I think there's a lot of wisdom packed into these words, and clearly a vision of a kind of sharing between man and woman, and yet a distinct identity to each that allows for this possibility of communion and generation. In Laudato Si, which was his famous encyclical on the environment, the Pope speaks of an ecology of man based on the fact that man too has a nature that he must respect and that he cannot manipulate at will. He also speaks of valuing one's own body in its femininity or masculinity. So these are kind of, broad, almost paradigm type statements that I think call us back to a center point, if you will, a point of balance. So the Pope notes that when the complementary and dimorphic nature of man and woman is called into question, the very notion of what it means to be human becomes lost. And he has the very provocative statement, gender ideology is the annihilation of man as the image of God. In other words, that this constitutes a very significant kind of a threat, and hence it's important for Catholics in particular, but Christians more generally, to be aware of this. There has been a very helpful pastoral letter that was published by Bishop Burbidge from the Diocese of Arlington, Virginia, and I just want to put it on your radar, called A Catechesis on the Human Person and Gender Ideology. It really offers an excellent overview of the Church's pastoral approach to gender ideology. Quick mention of our resources, the National Catholic Bioethics Center, our website, and my personal website, fathertad.com. There are additional resources available there. Also, a quick shout out for a book that we recently put out that I've contributed a chapter to, Dr. Ruse did as well, called Transgender Issues in Catholic Healthcare, dealing with a wide array of issues touching on the delivery of healthcare in situations where transgender patients are present. So what I want to do now is to get a little bit practical and just bring up a few examples where for Catholics there are likely to be concerns and issues, areas of discussion, pronouns being one of the more preeminent ones, that when people say to us, well, you've got to switch the set of pronouns that you've been using to describe me because of my gender dysphoria and because I'm undergoing transitioning now, this raises a number of concerns. So I'm going to simply offer this thesis broadly, that the use of the wrong pronouns for individuals constitutes a form of speaking untruthfully. This is not an authentic mode of communication for us to be pressured or compelled into this manner of speaking. So I'm going to offer some distinctions here, though. And I want to distinguish between a kind of personal or pastoral decision that might be made rather suddenly in the moment, because of brief interactions with somebody who maybe is transitioning, versus an ongoing relationship with an individual who might be undergoing steps of transitioning. So the example I like to use here, our former president, Dr. John Haas, was one time at a meeting in Chicago, bioethics meeting, and there was a panel discussion. So they had a long table, all the participants were sitting up at this table. He went up, sat down next to a rather attractive looking blonde woman, and got ready to start. And as he looked over at her hands, he noticed that she had very large hands. And he realized then that, in fact, she was a he. And, he commented afterwards to us, he said, in that particular setting, if I had used the correct, proper pronouns for this individual, it would have blown up in my face. It would have been impossible for the whole meeting to even continue. It would have been so disruptive. So he made a decision in the moment that that was not the place or the time to engage on the pronoun issue. But I want you to contrast that with a situation maybe of a student in a Catholic high school. He's been there as a freshman, a sophomore, and a junior. And in his junior year, he announces that he's going to transition during the summer and come back as a girl. And he starts saying to his teachers, when I come back, I want you to address me as she and as her. Well, of course, this is a very different situation. You have a long-standing relationship with many of these teachers and professors, and with many of the student body between them and this individual. And this is going to provide a moment in which it will be important for the teachers and others to engage this student and say, look, I understand why you're asking this. You're saying that you will feel very uncomfortable if we don't use the pronouns that you're telling us to use. But I have to make it clear to you, and I want to talk with you openly, honestly. I want to dialogue with you and with your parents about this, that if I am compelled to use these wrong pronouns, I will be even more uncomfortable than you. And so, to be able to honestly broach these topics and have a meaningful dialogue, this is essential in the setting of Catholic education, to not just let this kind of fly under the radar and everybody suddenly conform around this. So that ongoing relationship gives you greater depth to be able to plumb these issues and initiate the much needed dialogues. Now, I want to make one further distinction here about pronouns, which is that there may be a temptation sometimes to go institutional here, if you will. Meaning, if you've got a Catholic hospital, they may go so far as to say, well, any patient who comes in here and who says they want to be addressed by a particular pronoun, our definitive hospital policy, our institutional policy, will be to promote affirmation or require pronoun use like that. Well, that is a serious ethical problem if a Catholic institution makes this into some kind of official policy. So just to be aware of that also, that this would be, a form of violating the conscience of many of the workers in that setting, potentially. So I want to present a few more examples of pastoral situations that can crop up for Catholics, and just to kind of, again, boots on the ground sort of difficulties that may await us. So Mr. Rogers becomes Miss Rogers. So you have two Catholics who marry in the church. The husband, transitions to a woman several years later. The question arises in the parish, can the male to female husband receive communion? Is that allowable? Is that reasonable? Is that proper? The communion dress, you have a gender non-conforming boy who wants to wear a dress for first communion. Should that be allowed? Or the confirmation robe, similarly, a teen transitioning, maybe a boy to a girl wants to wear the girl's confirmation robe. Should this be tolerated, permitted? Well, in the Catholic school settings, let's recognize a couple of permissible accommodations. These would be, for example, the use of nicknames, if those are already used in the school. They don't really raise fundamental problems in and of themselves. Private bathrooms that would be open to all students would be consistent with the privacy needs of all within a Catholic school setting. But let's also look at some impermissible accommodations. School records ought not be changed unless those changes have already occurred through proper legal procedures. In other words, if a student shows up and says, I'm going to be transitioning, I want you to change all the records to indicate what I'm doing, that would not be appropriate in the Catholic school setting. It would be impermissible to open up the use of bathrooms used by the opposite sex. It would be impermissible to allow for the wearing of school uniforms of the opposite sex here for a number of reasons, including the potential for scandal, meaning theological scandal and misleading people around us. I'm going to mention about ordination issues as well, just since we're in the domain of the church here. It's important to remember that only a baptized male may receive holy orders. Birth sex would be key to eligibility for that. And mutilation would constitute an irregularity for men who have surgically transitioned and then repented of that act. Women pretending to be men, interestingly, have been unknowingly admitted to some Catholic seminaries. However, fortunately, they were discovered prior to going all the way through seminary and actually receiving holy orders. So you can see some of the confusion that can occur for us in these domains. So pastorally, what can we do as Catholics? I want to just offer some broad strokes, which we can take up further in the discussion. We have to remember that God is loving each person where they are and calling each one of them to holiness. We should welcome and accompany persons spiritually. This is something that the Holy Father often stresses. We should foster full human development and not some misguided notion of human development. We should affirm the person, but not all their choices. This is a mistake that's commonly made, to assume that affirmation means whatever they say automatically goes. We should charitably challenge false assumptions about truth and reality. Benedict XVI summarizes the central misunderstanding about gender this way. According to this philosophy, sex is no longer a given element of nature that man has to accept and personally make sense of. It's a social role that we choose for ourselves. So whether you're a man or a woman, a boy or a girl, ends up being putatively more of a disposition or feeling about yourself than a fact of nature. However, our biological sex, like our genetic makeup, our race, and our age, is an objective given and a natural characteristic, not a subjective choice. And the fullness of the church's thinking, would fall right in behind that kind of realism. So summing up, it is neither rational nor compassionate, it's a kind of false compassion, to affirm that false psychological self-concept that supports gender identity being different from biological sex. And Pope Francis in Amoris Laetitia in 2016 says effectively the same thing. It is, quote, one thing to be understanding of human weakness and the complexities of life, and another to accept ideologies that attempt to sunder what are inseparable aspects of reality. So he says we must protect our humanity, and this means, in the first place, accepting it and respecting it as it was created. So I'm going to conclude here with a passage from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, one of the important dicasteries at the Vatican, from a document that was written way back in 1975, before all of these transgender controversies burst onto the scene. But again, kind of summarizing a very healthy and appropriate and rational human anthropology, where it says, therefore, there can be no true promotion of man's dignity unless the essential order of his nature is respected. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Father Tad, and to all of our presenters for your excellent presentations. And now we go to questions, and I'll begin with the first one. From a biological standpoint, male and female can be genetically identified by chromosomes. So the question is, can we consider that mutations may be responsible for the fact that some individuals feel different in their sex? For example, the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, has stated that in rare instances, 47 chromosomes can result in XXY rather than XX female and XY male. So I'll leave the question there, and perhaps this is one that we can ask Dr. Cruz to begin with.
Well, I think the question relates to these disorders of sexual development, things that go awry, and it's certainly recognized that they do exist. Yet, we often limit this to the chromosomes, X and Y chromosomes, and it's important to recognize it's actually the genetic information on those chromosomes that direct the sexual differentiation. And it is the only situation where one can correctly say that sex is assigned at birth when there's genital ambiguity, when we're trying to figure out how this actually occurred. Because in all the other cases, and just to put this in perspective, 99.98% of individuals can be correctly identified as their sex by looking at the external genitalia, and there will be a correct recognition. But for these rare individuals, the goal is to understand what went awry in that developmental process and how this individual is going to be able to function in life, including their sexuality corresponding to male or female. And so it's probably beyond what we can discuss this evening, but it doesn't change that fundamental understanding of what sex is and what its purpose is. It is a reflection of individuals that have, just like any other condition that one would have. We wouldn't redefine how we understand the human being and other aspects of the human body by things that don't go according to plan. So we wouldn't call humans innately, unipeds or having a variation of other forms when it is not in line with what we know as what the human form is. So that's about all we could probably say this evening, but it's a very interesting and important topic, but probably tangential to the question of gender dysphoria for most of the conversation.
I guess I would just like to add that I think it is really important not to conflate the experience of, or the existence of those with disorders of sexual development with transgender individuals, right? Because I think that causes a lot of confusion. And most people who choose, to identify as trans do not have any kind of sexual ambiguity, right? So I think it actually does a disservice to those who have different sexual development conditions to use that as kind of a political football to support an idea that sex is a spectrum. I think when properly understood, intersex conditions need to be understood as variations within maleness and femaleness, not as exemptions from the sex binary. So I'll just add that.
All right, well, thank you both for your answers. I move now to a second question. This participant asks, how do you account for so many children in a wide spectrum of cultures identifying as more similar to the opposite sex? would that be considered a mental illness, similar to how we used to view homosexuality? Do you think that gender questioning by teens has always been around, part of growing up or maturing? And if not, why has it become so prevalent now?
Well, I can begin by just offering some hypotheses. I think that the answer is not clear, but from the perspective of a pediatrician, and I would expand that to the perspective of a parent, or even more to anyone who has gone through adolescence. There is a normal developmental process of questioning one's identity as one is growing up. There are many other situations throughout life where identity issues come up as people make transitions. And one kind of hypothesize that much of the increase of what we're seeing is this normal process of adolescent development being co-opted by ascribing the challenges to gender dysphoria. And so things that normally would come up be very difficult for an adolescent and allow them to resolve this over time, then are reinforced and drive them on to really the interventions that they're seeking. There are many other hypotheses that could be made, and certainly a lot that could be said about the rapid increase that we're seeing and the changing. I didn't have a chance to go through the demographics. We're seeing a exponential increase in the people that are children that are presenting with this condition, and it has changed from being predominantly males identifying as females to now the greatest growth is in females identifying as males. And often, so there's some emerging data about this happening within social networks. It does not, it's not consistent with the hypothesis that it's driven by genetic differences or even environmental influences. It really speaks more strongly to a social influence.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would also just raise the scenario. I mean, looking back on going through puberty, it was such a difficult time, I think, for myself and so many other people around me. And I think when some of the challenges that young people face, when they have this opportunity, I mean, for example, you could have somebody who is in a school who is struggling socially, trying to figure out their own identity, and feeling like they're largely, a nobody or a kind of even a zero. Then if they do come out as transgender, things change very quickly around them sometimes. And you'll have a social setting where people suddenly, oh, I have to use different pronouns. Oh, everybody notices me now. Everywhere I walk, I have become the center of attention, where previously I was nobody. So I think there may be some of those dynamics where people are looking for kind of a quick mode of affirmation as kids going through a tough time. I just, throw that out onto the airwaves as a possible consideration as well.
Great, thank you all. Our next question is a question of legal changes. So there's a great deal of legislation and rapid legal change taking place right now, and challenges to the church's position in this area. As teachers in a public school, as medical practitioners, etc., how can one continue to be faithful to the truths of gender and biological sex when there are now legal threats to employment, to licenses, etc., in the mix?
I'll just offer a quick thought on that, which would be that I think the escalating threats that question alludes to are very real. And I think they call for several things. They call for us as Catholics to first become familiar with the issues. It's wonderful to hear that there's so many people who signed up for this evening webinar. I think that's a first piece, is to become familiar with the issues. And then I think to also have a certain measure of courage. I mean, because this is a very, very hard time that we're in. And together with that courage, to exercise the virtue of prudence, which means that you recognize there are certain battles that, maybe are not your battle exactly, but Nonetheless, there are others that are, and as it draws really closer to your own domain and focus, that the grace of God there may be leading you to be a bit of a sign of contradiction. And there may be some expense to that. There may be a price sometimes to be paid as well. But a lot of times, if you use the virtue of prudence carefully there, you can navigate and do good and enlighten consciences in ways that when you look back on it, you realize, wow, I did this in a fashion with the help of the Lord that was actually beneficial. It wasn't just sort of going in and casting asperges or detonating bombs kind of thing. And so I think that's something to, again, seek divine help, that we can each be instruments in the hand of the Lord on these very, very important issues.
So our next question is, there are a handful of questions that are worried about the pain of those struggling with their gender and how our actions might be harming them or seem self-centered and non-compassionate. How do we manage to be compassionate and to walk with those around us?
Well, I will offer my own experience, with this, that the importance of interacting with individuals that are suffering from, this difficulty really is to act first and foremost and consistently out of love. So that it's very difficult. The situations where you have the passing comments that Father Tad had mentioned are more challenging. But if you're in a situation for developing a relationship with an individual, whether it's within a family, within a school setting, what is most critical is for them to recognize, or for them to know that you recognize their human dignity, and that you love them in an authentic way, and not only say that, but by your actions live that out. Once that relationship is established, I think individuals will respect the boundaries that one can have, and not acting in ways that are contrary to what one sees as in their best interest, and it will be seen in the proper way. The danger is that it often is presented in an adversarial way, where that there's only that we're forcing this on them without that charity aspect. And I think that the situations where most productive is when one is acting out of love. One can have a disagreement, but still maintain that relationship. And I think that's critical for being able to accompany somebody and then have any opportunity to help them and journey with them in the problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I mean, for me, this is where this is the crux of the issue, right? I mean, it's this middle ground where love and truth meet, and you have to somehow hold on to both. This is certainly the time where I spend the most angsty pondering myself, right? It's one thing to do the ideological critique, right? And then it's another thing to actually think, okay, well, how do I enter into a relationship with people who disagree with me, who live in this kind of different paradigm than I do, right? So I guess there are kind of a couple things. One, I would question the use of the word harm. I think there is very real harm being done to gender nonconforming young people through this framework. I think they are being medicalized. I think they are being ushered into identities that will lead them to very painful procedures and lifelong medicalization that's going to make a lot of people a lot of money. And I think we should be asking deep questions about that, because there's that kind of harm. There's the harm of, someone not using the right pronoun and being, disrupting someone's identity, right? But then there's also the harm of, setting someone on to a quality of life and compromising their physical health. So I think there's very real harm being done there as well. But I guess one, like, this might be a dumb analogy, I don't know. But one thing I was thinking about, our Catholic faith and our Catholic understanding of the world and of human beings and of anthropology, like, it's kind of like this life raft we're in, right? We've got this thing keeping us up and afloat amidst all the kind of tumult of our culture, right? And there are people who are not in the life raft who are kind of swimming around in the water. And one response to the people swimming around in the water is to mock them, to look down upon them, to feel self-righteous, to tell them how wrong they are, and to feel so safe and warm in our little lifeboat. That's a terrible response. Another terrible response is to have so much compassion that you kind of forget your own reliance on that lifeboat and you jump into the water too, right? So what does it look like then to stay within the truth while reaching out in love to the people who are outside of it, right? I've been thinking even like what would a homily be like that, is on the beauty of Genesis and the sacramentality of the body, but then ends in this kind of invitation, like, if there's anyone out here who identifies as trans, like, I would love to meet you. I would love to hear your story and talk more about what our Catholic faith might mean, and to kind of open this door to a relationship rather than this punitive, like, if you don't believe this, you're out, or like, oh, the world's so crazy these days, boys are wearing dresses, that's like not a helpful approach, right? But I think speaking the truth and professing the beauty of the Catholic faith, and then also like really reaching out to people who don't see it that way, and to say, like, I'm interested in hearing your story. I'm interested in talking with you about these things. And they might not be interested, and that's, you can't control that. But I do think it's important to hold on to love and truth, because anytime you let go of one or the other, you've entered into this kind of counterfeit territory.
I think that's a great analogy, Dr. Favale. So first of all, I want to thank our panelists, and I want to thank you, our guests, for coming, for asking such thoughtful and insightful questions, and for really engaging this challenging topic.